Well, I'd been in the Pacific for about 5 years now, and as you can see from this chart, I initially started out going pretty much due west because my ultimate destination was going to be the Philippines, which you see on the left side of the chart. But I had to make a few detours, a couple of detours. At one point, I headed due north across the equator from Fiji when my mast was broken. And then I was still trying to get to the Philippines, but I was forced to make another detour up to Guam to make repairs. And but my goal was to get to the Philippines. And in Guam, I met a guy there named Rain, and he was a deckhand working on some of the tourist boats where I had my boat anchored or was in the dock. And Rain agreed to go with me. He wanted to go to Yap, and I also wanted to go to Yap because I'd been there a couple of times previously, and it was right on the way to the Philippines. So we agreed to do that. Unfortunately, we didn't make it to Yap. I made a slight miscalculation, got too far downwind of Yap, but we proceeded on to the next island, which was called Palau. And I assured Rain that Palau was a very nice place, had some great diving, and that he would enjoy it. And so we sailed on a few more days until we finally saw Palau, and there were plenty of fish in the ocean coming in there, and of course inside was some magnificent diving. So gradually Rain warmed to the idea of Palau. We stopped into a place called Sam's Dive Shop. That's where I anchored my boat. Had a few beers, actually quite a few beers. That's Sam's boat you see in the top of this screen there. And so we just kind of started to look into being in Palau for a little while before Rain would leave. And so he was happy that we were going to be doing some diving and sightseeing, and it turned out to be a pretty good time. So fairly soon, I think the next day we went diving. Palau has some of the best diving in the world, and I've been diving a long time, almost 50 years, and it's really a spectacular place. One of the things you see there on one of the drop-offs is aggregations of gray reef sharks. And these are really interesting to watch. I'd actually been bitten by one about 25 years or 35 years before that, but these ones were non-aggressive, and they would just cruise back and forth along the drop-off looking for fish to eat, and they would just kind of cruise along, conserving their energy. Every once in a while you'd see them attack another fish. But it was so, the water was so clear, and it was really just, I think we did about 6 dives here, and they were all good dives. There were also spawning aggregations. I get to see a few of those later on, but overall, Palau has to be one of the best diving spots around. We also did some tours of these islands. They're called the Rock Islands, and we also got some kayaks and paddled around a little bit, going underneath the bridge. And these formations, they're kind of typical of Palau because Palau is mainly made of limestone, at least the southern part. And the limestone is undercut in many places by the wave action, so you get these kind of sort of mushroom-like islands. That's what the Rock Islands really are. Here you see the gap in this particular harbor, and here's another one. It's called the Pinchers because it's shaped like the pinchers of a crab. I climbed up at a radio antenna and took this picture. In the middle of the picture you see it's actually a pretty large sailboat belonging to a friend of mine, and in the bottom left there's a operation to recover a World War II aircraft that had been shot down during the war, because it was a big battleground also. So here's another picture of the Pinchers, which is the gap that you have to go out to get to the other Rock Islands, which you see kind of in the distance there on the left. Now, about this time, we ran into this guy, Rene Menz, and he was the owner of a German restaurant there in Palau called Kramer's. And Rene was a very interesting guy, very talented guy, and he was also very interested in aquaria fish. And he took us up to a river. He didn't tell us at the time, but there were actually crocodiles living in this river. but the idea was to collect some fish and shrimp for Renee's aquarium. So Rain and I helped to check some traps and to just capture whatever we could. But mainly it was just to see the interior of Palau. It's interesting because Rain on the right was the guy that came with me from Guam to Palau, and Renee on the left is the guy that eventually went with me from Palau to the Philippines. Now about this time I ran into a lady named Joy Graham, and I'd never met her, but she was a good friend of a guy that I sailed and dove with, Ellie Edmondson. And so she was there as part of a dive group, and we did a tour. We got a taxi and we went around Palau, and we visited some places. Now this is the capital of Palau in Koror, and it's kind of modeled after the United States White House. It's fairly recent, and Palau has only been an independent nation for, I guess, about 40 years now. So we walked around here, and you can see there are motifs all around the thing. Now this is one of the motifs. It's called the Palauan money bird. It's actually a type of a wading bird called a whimbrel. And here you see it's kind of picking up these little circles with crosses. These are supposed to denote money. And the money bird is a symbol of wealth and power. And so you can there's a little story behind it. And so these pictures adorn the sides of the Capitol building. So we walked around there, and then we stopped at a traditional type of Palauan house called a bai. And bais are places where people would relax and talk, and sometimes they would have dances and things. And it's similar to the houses that they had in Yap. And you can see these motifs. Sometimes they depict battles, sometimes they depict voyages. This is the interior of the bai where people would generally sit around. These were kind of segregated, these bais. The women had their own bais, and the men would like to just kind of congregate and talk about things like fishing and I guess going to war and going sailing and things. So about this time I made another trip up to the northern part of Palau, and this is an area that I later on did some research diving. But this place was called the Japanese Lighthouse, and it was a place that was bombed by the U.S. military during World War II, but it had a really great view of the islands to the north. So I climbed up there. I took some pictures of what was left of the lighthouse because it had been severely destroyed. It had been destroyed during World War II. And you see a lot of World War II things around Palau. People are always finding bombs in their backyards, and they have to get someone over to excavate and remove it. And you can see this is probably the lighthouse keeper's quarters, and it was pretty well damaged. Another thing I saw up there are these, they're called stone faces or megaliths, and they were made about 100 AD, and they were supports for bais. They were said to be, some of them depicted faces of the gods, and they're kind of found throughout Palau, also in Yap, and I believe in Tonga. Well, about this time I started going to the Rock Islands, and here I took my kayak and I explored this one island, and this one had very old stone walls built by the Palauans, again about 2,000 years ago. I actually kind of got lost during this trip, but I saw these very interesting things. They're called stone money. And what it is, the Palauans had a type of stone on their island that was not found in Yap, which is the island to the north. So the Yapese would voyage with their sailing canoes to Palau and quarry these rocks and form them into stones and bring them back on their canoes to Yap, where they're used sort of as currency. The hole in the center is for carrying them because they're quite large. Some of them are broken, like this one. This is another one that's in a little better shape, but it's interesting that these stone money actually have history. Each one has a history, and people know how many people died, for instance, on the voyage to get them. Sometimes there were even battles because the Palauans didn't always want the Yapese to come to their island and start carving up their rocks and things. So there's a lot of history. But most times I stayed in this group of islands called Oolong. There were 3 main islands, and I really loved this place. It was so peaceful, very calm inside, a lot of caves and things like that. Pretty nice diving too. So I would kayak around there and kind of walk across the land and just really relax and enjoy it. There weren't many people out there. Here you can see these notches cut into the limestone. They actually are a way of dating sea level rise. Now this cave, the lighting is not that great, but it was used by the Japanese during World War II. They stashed their oil drums there. I think there were like 500 of them or so. They're in pretty bad shape, of course, for being there so long. But it just goes to show that the Japanese were really fortified in Palau. So I looked in here. It was a really big cave. And about this time, Sam from Sam's Tours came out with his worker Shabazz, and Sam had a boat, and he would come out with his dog Shadow. You see Shadow in the back there. And this time we went out fishing and also doing a little tour of the islands. Here's one of the islands in the Oolong group, and there's Shadow. Shadow was quite humorous. He would run around trying to catch the land crabs, and then he'd try to dig them up. But sometimes he'd get them. Most times he wouldn't be able to find them. So I just stayed within this harbor. I really, between the main anchorage and this place, I kind of split my time. Just because it wasn't very far to go by boat. It was just about a 2-hour drive. Now, Sam would organize these regattas where the boats that were there would go out and do a little race, and then would come back and all the boats would kind of raft up, and we'd have a little party. People would bring their own food, and there'd be beer and things. And it was just a good way to keep in practice of sailing, because you really need to do that pretty often. And so these get-togethers, people would bring things like their stand-up paddle boards, and of course the water's beautiful for swimming. So these are mostly people that I knew from sailing. And there must have been about probably 7 boats on this particular one. So these are a couple of friends. That's my friend Grant, who I'd met first in French Polynesia. This is Ricardo, that's my boat he's on. He was my mate on the regatta. This is Pete Allen, who I also had known crossing through the Pacific. This is Torsten, the dive manager. And this is my friend Justin and his girlfriend. And Justin turned out to be a good friend and a very helpful guy. Here he is on his boat. We did a little trip around the islands, and Justin was very helpful. He knew a lot about electronics, and he ended up going to Japan. I believe that's where he is right now. But his family they built a dock, and they would go off to help people on some of the outer islands to put in solar panels and things. And on this occasion, they let me stay on their dock, which was quite nice. I would be able to get off the boat from time to time, and it was a beautiful little lagoon. You could do some great snorkeling around there. And about this time I started to spearfish. And Palau has got a lot of fish. Some areas are protected and you can't spearfish, but quite a lot of it is open to fishing. And so I would go out. I would never take too much. I usually get one fish per day, but it was really great. I really loved it. I started out getting some of the easier fish like this jack. I got this job fish one day, and it was a pretty big fish and fed me for quite a while. I was very happy to have been able to spear it. And so, I would maybe get a fish every few days, and that would last me. I'd usually get it in the morning and then cook it up for breakfast. This one fed me for about 4 days. It's a giant sweet lips. And about this time I ran into this guy on the right, Pat Collin, and he's a famous marine biologist. He'd been in Palau for about 25 years, and he had a conservation agency there. Here we are in his boat, and we were going out to put some sensors in the water. And I also worked with Pat on a project that was looking at spawning aggregations of groupers, which is something that I'm really interested in. So this silver thing in the background is an A-frame for lowering and raising the sensors. So that was really nice. It let me go out and allowed me to see some parts of Palau that I wouldn't normally have gotten to. So about this time it was time to leave, and Renee, who is the owner of the restaurant, Kramer's, agreed to go with me to the Philippines. He'd been there 3 times on sailboats previously, so he's a logical person, a great resource to go to the Philippines with. And I really wanted someone to go with me because there are a lot of fishing boats around Palau, and it's good to have another person along for a lookout. So we sailed. I think it took us 8 days to get there. But eventually we arrived in the Philippines, which had been my destination for many, many years. And, we checked into customs, and I just began settling down in the Philippines. And I was very, very happy to have finally made it there after all these years. So this is where I am right now. I'm in the Philippines. And I'm going to make more videos about the Philippines. So thanks, and I hope you can share and subscribe.